Good afternoon, everyone. So wonderfully full room here, and we've got a similar number of people online by the look of it. So not a bad gathering. So we've got family, friends, colleagues, neighbours, all kinds of connections. I'm just saying to a few people, for me personally, today is an absolutely unique, never to be repeated, I suspect, meeting of people from all kinds of strands of life. So that in itself is an absolute joy. So thank you all, whether online or where I know some of you come from quite distance to be here, or even taking part in different time zones. So thank you. So yeah, today we're going to officially launch this book, Celsius: A Life and Death by Degrees, which came out at the end of September. So I'll start with I'll do some more thanks later on, but some special thanks here. First of all, to the whole team at Wolfson College and the Oxford Centre for Life Writing. You just met Alice. Also, my publisher, Claire, is here, I think, somewhere. Where are you, Claire? She's coming. And then also to local friends from writers in Oxford and a few other writing groups that I've been involved with. Before I go any further, we need to find a few more chairs for some friends at the back there. So can we go hunting somewhere, please? Thank you, Alice. That's great. Be seated in a moment, I'm sure. So when I started this work, which in earnest was about in 2020, and I've mentioned to people that I was planning to write a book about Celsius, I would say on average about half of people, their immediate reaction was, oh, so there's a person called Celsius. I said, and if you think about it, most of the units through which we measure the world around us, joules, newtons, I hate to use the F word, Fahrenheit. Watts, they're all people back in the day. So, but whether you were aware that Celsius, the person, existed, I absolutely guarantee that all of you already today will have met this young man and all of his amazing discoveries. So if you check the weather forecast to see what kind of day it was going to be, if you use the sat nav or Google Maps to find your way here, if you put the kettle on, if you open the fridge to get some milk, you will have encountered the legacy of this young man. And I say young because he died when he was just 42, and the older one gets, the younger that seems. Let's make sure it's working. Not working at the minute. Maybe a short pause. There we go. Yeah. So I say he died when he was 42 from tuberculosis, and at that particular time, tuberculosis, or consumption as it would then have been called, was sweeping across Europe. So he was certainly not alone in meeting that rather painful death. So for the next 25 minutes, given that you've already, as I said, met this person already today, I'm just going to expand a little bit more about him. So I'm going to cover, why does this person matter? I believe he does really matter. So where are we? 280 years since his death. Why is it important that we think about this person? What can we learn from him now? So we'll talk a bit about that. I'm also going to share, some of you who are involved in it, a few of my own literal footsteps of following in his footsteps. So as most of you all know, I've been traveling around a bit in Europe and other places to retrace his footsteps. And since today's been kindly hosted by the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, which, as Alice said, I had the pleasure of being a visiting scholar for 2 years, I thought it important to just reflect for a few lessons on the actual writing process as well. But I thought we'd start, this is where I need you to help me out, with this portrait of Anders Celsius. There's probably only two maybe three usable images of him. I mean, the image on the front of the cover, I think, is actually just an amalgam of the two portraits that were done, and I'll show you the other one in a minute. But this painting was painted in about 1730, but he was living in his late 20s, and he'd just been made Professor of Astronomy at Uppsala University in Sweden. So I just want you to gaze at him for a moment, his poise, his expression. What kind of person do you think Anders Celsius might be? I mean, what does that picture, what kind of words does that conjure for any of you?
Confidence.
Confidence. And what makes you say that, Nigel?
Just the way he's looking forward. His
Yeah.
mouth,
Yeah.
his nose. Yeah, he looks a very confident young man.
He does, doesn't he? I think his confidence was of a gentle sort, but very much so there nevertheless. So I completely agree with that. And there's plenty of evidence, I think, that he was very confident in his own abilities, very much so. Yeah. Any other thoughtful? I agree. And what's picking that? Where do you get that, Leslie?
His eyes.
Yeah, there's a certain sort of a strong but restful gaze, isn't there? He's looking at you and he's thinking something, isn't he? Yeah.
His intelligence shines through.
Doesn't it? I mean, look at the size of that forehead.
Sure.
One.
Sticks rather close.
Yeah, yeah. Bit of, I think it's a Swedish thing.
No, but his intelligence,
Yeah.
clarity, directness.
I agree. Yeah, yeah.
He looks friendly. It's almost.
Yeah,
Composed,
I agree. Yeah, there's a certain sort of poise
but
and
Bjorn Borg.
yeah. I've never thought of that before, but I see where you're coming from.
Nothing shabby about it. It's quite particular about his.
Yeah, yeah. So actually, that's what come on. I mean, he struggled financially for most of his life, actually, and in the book, there's a list of a very meager list of possessions that he left behind, and he spent most of the money he had on his science, as we'll hear about building observatories, employing assistants, and so on. So he certainly didn't indulge his own wealth, but yeah, absolutely right. Well, time for one more. Any other reactions?
It's a bit tired and underfed.
Tired and underfed. Yeah, he probably was. As I said, you know, life was not particularly easy. And actually, at the time we've been doing this, he kept on, because he was very capable on all the other things that people have said. He kept on being given jobs, but none of them had a salary attached to it. So by the time this was painting, although he just had been promoted to a full professor of astronomy, I mean, that was pretty much his first paid job. Otherwise, he'd been scratching around, earning a bit of money, teaching here and there. So yeah, he probably was a little bit underfed, actually. So I agree with all of those things. And I think it's mainly, well, for many of those personal qualities that I find him so captivating. And I think it's from those personal qualities that many of his achievements flowed. And once again, why we're still talking about him 280 years on. So let's follow his story a little bit. So he was the fourth in line, I guess you'd say, of actually quite illustrious set of astronomy professors, all in Uppsala in Sweden. Which, if you're not familiar with it, think Swedish Oxford. Basically, it's a small city, absolutely dominated by its university, which was the first in Scandinavia. Late comer within 1410 or whenever it was opened, but yeah, so very much the Swedish equivalent of Oxford. So both his grandfathers, Magnus Celsius, and then Anders Spole, which is his maternal grandfather, and then his father Niels, were all preceded him as astronomy professors at Uppsala. But by no means was it an easy ascent, and certainly no guarantee that he would follow in their footsteps. So all of the things you said earlier on about just his intelligence and his focus and so on, it was by dint of talent that he got there, certainly. We may mention it later on, but when he was 6 months old, pretty much the whole of Uppsala was devastated by one of a series of fires, and he was very lucky, I think, to survive. And one of the things that did survive was some of the textbooks that belonged to his grandfather Magnus, and it was those surviving textbooks that then provided the basis for his early learning and studies, which we'll come back to later on. So the thing he's actually most known for, of course, which is his temperature scale, centigrade, literally 100-point scale. That actually came very much towards the end of his life. I wouldn't say it was an afterthought, but it was a kind of a bit of a footnote, if you like, to a career, and explain some of the other things he did in a minute. So this is Anders Celsius, the very first Celsius thermometer, which is held in the museum, which Pippa and I went to see. Was it last year? Yeah, last year. So you can see on the side, and just about before I read it, it says Celsius, and those are numbers on the scribe written in his own handwriting. But if you look at it, there's something a bit odd about this thermometer, because the top of the thermometer, which is on your left here, has 0, and it goes down to 100. So when the Celsius scale, or centigrade scale, which then took its name, was originally conceived by its inventor, Celsius had 100 degrees as freezing and 0 degrees as boiling. So it got turned upside down after his death. There's some debate about who turned it upside down and why. Something to do with negative numbers, but you know me in numbers, it's not my strong suit. So somebody explained to me, when we were over in Uppsala, we finally found this helpful little thing in the shop, which is has the original Celsius scale, so upside down as we know it, against the reverse scale as we've gone on to use it. Personally, I find it even more confusing when you've got those two. Absolutely just playing through your head, but if it's of help, then have a look at that later on. And as I said, this was really, you know, a late comer in his career. So some of the other things that he did in his working life, he was the person who actually unlocked what causes in our hemisphere, the northern lights, or in the southern hemisphere, their equivalent, as to what caused them. And I'll ask you this: is it coincidence that we've just been having the northern lights? I don't want to overreach myself, but somebody somewhere is making sure I get a bit of free promotion here. So all kinds of theories abounded at the time when he was studying. There are various theories it was caused by angry gods, dragons, volcanoes, but no, it was Celsius who worked out it's kind of to do with magnetically charged particles being ejected from the sun and being agitated in our atmosphere. So we have him to thank for knowing what's going on in the sky. Anyone seen the Northern Lights in the last week or so?
Yeah.
Brilliant. We missed them, unfortunately. And while we're on astronomy, we also missed the comet of the century. So Northern Lights, that was one of his great achievements. Over on the right-hand side there, that rock is in a little island in the Baltic Sea, just off the Swedish coast, which once again people visited. And that particular rock, although you can't really see it very well there, has been marked originally by Celsius in 1731, and then century intervals ever since. And what it appears to show is that the sea levels are dropping in the Baltic. So why might that be, we ask ourselves. In fact, that's what Celsius asked himself, and it was him who worked out, actually, no, it's not the sea levels are drawing, it's the land that's going up. So as the weight of glass in the last ice age get released, the land gradually, very slowly springs back up. So we are not too far away from the 2031 measurement, and we'll see what it says. Of course, by then rising sea levels because of climate change might have compensated, but we'll wait and see. So that's another one. Down here on the left, you probably can't see, you probably just about see the date 1722. So 1722. So just over 300 years ago, in a little corner of the garden of Uppsala Museum, sorry, University rather, Celsius and one of his colleagues began collecting temperature records, rainfall, all kinds of other climate related things. He's the first climate records, if you like. He's the first climate scientist, the first earth scientist, and that logs, you can see that's a number 1 there, has been maintained ever since unbroken. It's the longest continuous climate record in the world, and carries on to this day. And you'll see a picture in the book of me visiting its modern equivalent today. So it's because we have data like that we know what's going on with climate. Without that kind of data, a lot would be just based on rather shorter term records. He also, the little bottle with the holes in it is meant to indicate air pressure. I couldn't think of a better way of indicating it, but people didn't really understand how air pressure varied by altitude and by location. So he descended into the depths of Sweden's silver and copper mines, but also up into the heights of the cathedral towers with his great big barometer, checking air pressure, and he worked out the relationship between altitude or depth and air pressure. And then finally, and this is one I'm going to explore a little bit more, he was part of a absolutely pioneering expedition that determined the exact shape of planet Earth. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Any flat earthers in? Okay. So, as I said, I think a career of extraordinary breadth and intensity, and as we'll come back to later on, I mean, he died when he was 42, really only a 2 decades working life, so he achieved an enormous amount in that time of really fundamental things. So his times, he lived at the absolute peak, if you like, of the European Enlightenment in the first half of the 18th century. And it was very common, as I'm sure many of you will know at that time, that people like him, I mean, either very wealthy people or people of great scholarly attributes, they would go off on a grand tour of one form or another. So the map there illustrates his grand tour, which went from Uppsala up in the top right hand corner, down through Germany to Berlin, Nuremberg, then on into Italy, Bologna, Rome, Venice, then across to France, Paris, which will be very important, and spent a little bit of time in the UK as well. So he lived in London for a while, and he crossed back over to France, and then the Great Arctic Circle expedition began, which we'll come on to in a minute. And I think that brings me to the sort of first lesson, I guess, really, or important point that I think we could all just be reminded, not just from those travels, but in all his work. He was an extraordinary internationalist, multilingual, completely relaxed in the company of anyone from any other culture or country. He just believed that there was an innate value in internationalism and in sharing information and in working together. And I think that's a lesson we could all reflect on a little bit. And it was when he reached Paris in the spring of 1734 that by sheer, I guess you'd call it good luck, but by calculation, sorry, I should have said that the stops on his tour had a very specific objective. Because he was an astronomer, and because at that time there were no astronomical observatories in Scandinavia, his objective was to visit all the great observatories of Europe, particularly Bologna and Berlin and Paris, see what they were like, and then go back to Sweden and say, right, we need one of these, please. That was his objective, very specifically, of his tour. And as I said, when he got to Paris, by kind of good luck, really, the great scientific debate of his age, of the mid-18th century, was really coming to the board, and he just happened to be the right person in the right place at the right time to have the opportunity to play a key part in it. So the big debate, and I'm simplifying here slightly, I admit, was whether the Earth is broadly shaped like a satsuma, slightly flattened at the poles, or whether it's more shaped like a lemon, whether it's kind of squeezed at the equator. Now, for reasons of gravity, because of Newton's universal theory of gravitation, if you have something like that spinning on its axis, it won't remain round. It will have to be flattened in one direction. So the big debate was, which way is the Earth deformed? And the kind of two figures, if you like, it were Sir Isaac Newton, who's already died for some decades before, but then also Cassini, who at that time had established the observatory in Paris and was the first in the dynasty of people who carried his name. So it's, I suppose it was a bit like Oasis v Blur, really, or Stones v Beatles, if you like, of the day. But this great debate that was just absolutely coming to the time of it. So into this debate steps the fairly young, I think he was only in his early 20s, King of France, Louis XV, and he said, I know what we'll do. I'll sponsor 2 expeditions. We'll send one to the equator to measure a degree of latitude there. So what's the distance of a degree of latitude at the equator? And we'll send another group of people as far possible towards the North Pole. I mean, we're talking 300 years before the first actual visit to the North Pole, as far north as you can get to measure a degree of latitude, and we'll compare the differences. Because obviously, if it was a perfect sphere, then the curvature would be the same at any point. So by measuring those 2 distances, that you would work out which way the Earth was deformed. So the expedition which he was part of, in simple terms, headed for Lapland, what we might know as Lapland, so northern Finland and Sweden. And the destination for the start of it was a place called Tornio, which, as you can see, is just at the top of the Baltic Sea there. As it narrows, the Baltic Sea, it's called the Gulf of Bothnia. And right at the top there, you'll see Tornio, which today sits absolutely on the modern border between Finland and Sweden. It was all Sweden back then. Finland didn't exist in quite the same way it does now, but that's where he was heading. And he went with his French counterparts from Dunkirk by sea around Denmark. Got somebody from Denmark here, and then around up there. I say that as a slight simplification. Celsius made it as far as Denmark. He'd been so seasick, the weather was so terrible that he got off the boat there and then went the rest over land. But anyway, the rest of the ship went up that way, and they arrived in Tornio. And he was one of about a dozen scientists, some of them barely older than him. So in fact, one of the particular mathematicians, I think, was only 19 on this expedition. But a real collection of the talents, which I think is the other real standout feature of Celsius as a scientist. He was just an absolutely instinctive collaborator. Yes, he could do stuff on his own, but he was brilliant at working in teams, working with other people, assembling different talents, and indeed being both a team leader and a team player. And once again, if we think about our own exploits in life. There's some strong messages there as well, aren't there? So he played an absolutely pivotal role, first of all, in deciding where they should go. And by, once again, coincidence, his grandfather, who I showed you earlier on, Anders Spole, and also his friend Carl Linnaeus, who was his contemporary at Uppsala, they had both been to Tornio within the last few decades. So he said, I know a bit about this part of the country, we should go there. So it was him who decided where they should go. And also how they should go about this task of measuring a degree of latitude, because we're talking, roughly speaking, 110, 112 kilometers distance. So how do you measure accurately 110 or 112 kilometers? So this Celsius, he worked out how best to do it. So if we zoom in a bit, if you like, this is a contemporary map. So we've got Tornio at the bottom there, which is the mouth of the river. And then you can see we've got the River Torny, which flows 620 kilometers down from well north of the Arctic Circle. It's actually Europe's longest free-flowing river, by which I mean it doesn't have any dams, it doesn't have any locks, it's just a continuous stream of water from, as I said, way up in the Arctic down and then down into the top of the Gulf of Bothnia there. So that's what it looked at kind of in Celsius's time. And you'll notice, and we'll come back to why this is helpful, if you look at the little compass here, it flows pretty much exactly due north-south, which is helpful if you're trying to measure a line of latitude, because obviously you've got a nice fixed point there to work on. So 290 odd years later, my friend Mark, who's here, and we went down just to see what it was like. So this picture was taken shortly after we arrived in Tornio on the 4th of May, a couple of years ago. So even in May, I think this photo was taken at about 11:30 at night, pretty light up in those latitudes. River still frozen, and you can probably just about see evidence of how the locals like to drive across. So some time marks are there. I suspect by the time we were there, Mark, it was getting a little bit dicey whether you want to do that or not. And in fact, we were there, what, 10 days or so, a week? In that period, the ice really started to break up and move, so we couldn't have timed it better. Actually, we saw it in its completely frozen state, but also saw what happened then once the ice started to move. So over on that bank, that's Sweden, and this shot, well, it's actually on the bridge, I think I took this, but it's basically from the Finland bank. So as I said, it's the modern border between the two countries. So as you head upstream, I mean quickly, it's obviously less wide, less deep. So the river further upstream is probably 20 kilometers or so upstream from Tornio, something like that. It's a raging torrent, and so it's flowing, as you're looking at it, from right to left. Now, just think about this for a minute. Celsius and his friends have got a row upstream. So that brings me to my next point. I mean, just the extraordinary energy of the people. And right, he probably wasn't doing much of the rowing, I suspect, but no mean feat to get up a river in those kind of conditions. So over several miles, and actually just brave. I mean, we stood by the banks of that, and you'd be pretty brave to go anywhere near that river in that condition. So he was somebody who was absolutely involved in scientific endeavour, but also real physical endeavour as well, which we'll come back to. So the method that Celsius came up with to measure this 1 degree of latitude, 110-12 kilometres, was to use this north-south axis of the river and then pick out a number of high points, hills on either side of the river, which they would climb up, chop all the trees down on the top and build these kind of observation points or viewing points, or sometimes a little mini observatory. And then they would join all of those up into a grand chain of lines, which they, through trigonometry, then worked out the distance by trigonometry. So you can probably on this map, we've got Tornio at the bottom, the farthest point, Kittish, you'll see up there, which we'll come to in a minute. And that's roughly speaking one degree of latitude, 110, 112 kilometers. So they've got to go upstream in those kind of conditions, find the mountains, chop all the trees down, do all the surveying. So you can probably just about see these lines on it. I don't know how they did it. They did all that in 66 days. Extraordinary endeavour, and so the fortitude to do it. And it was nice when we were there that achievement is still very much people locally in this area are proud of, know about, remember. So there's in the town centre in Tornio, there's this sort of stylized version of all the measurement triangles there. So it's something that's still, even though it's some years ago now, obviously, very much something that's remembered and people are proud of and know about, which is really nice. And when you get up to the very northern part of it, as I say, just about it's called Kittis there. Kittis is short for Mount Kittisfara. So on the hill up there is this rather atmospheric, I think, stone pyramid. That's my friend Mark there taking a photo of it. And that marks the northernmost point of their expedition. So they've gone from the coast all the way up this river in 66 days, doing all the measuring, and that pyramid, obviously added much later, marks the northernmost point. So just to put it in perspective, look how many trees there are around there. So at every point, there's something like 30 hills they had to do. They were chopping that amount of trees down just to get the sight lines. And it doesn't really show on that photo, but it was pretty snowy when we were there. So while Mark and the other people were there, I just sort of walked off for a moment, had a little bit of a moment of reflection and thought about what I was doing on top of this hill in Finland. And it was a little bit breezy, and there was quite a lot of rustling of leaves and so on. And I can't help but imagine I could hear Celsius saying to me, "Who are you and why are you following me around?" both good questions. However, even once they'd done all the surveying, there was one more key task they had to do, because to verify the results of their maths, they had to physically measure a portion of that baseline. So they found they had to find a baseline. Once again, it was Celsius who came up with the idea. He said, because his colleagues suggested all kinds of crazy things, like chopping down entire stretches of forest. He said, no, we'll just wait for the river to freeze, then you'll have a lovely flat surface running north-south, and we'll just measure it on the ice. So they had to wait until winter for the ice, and then they set about measuring this baseline. So they found a dead straight, absolutely north-south line measuring about 14 kilometers long, and they had one little group of people at one end and another group at the other end, and equipped with 30-foot wooden poles, and they just began measuring. So they put the pole down on the ice, mark it, pick it up, put it down again, mark it, pick it up, and so on. So for 14 kilometers, and they eventually crossed over in the middle and carried on. Took them 10 days, which is not bad going. I mean, once again, this is the middle of winter, 35 degrees below, almost permanent darkness, sleeping on the ice in tents, really hard living, which once again, I think just shows the incredible fortitude that Celsius and his colleagues had. I think the kind of fortitude that only comes from knowing you're doing something important, not just to you, but to humankind or even the universe itself. This was an important endeavor they were involved in. So once the two teams had crossed over and they arrived at their destinations, they just because this is ever right in the winter solstice now, managed to pack up all their gear and head down the river again back to Tornio just before the ice completely locked them in for the winter. And over the winter, they sat down and looked at their calculations. So the two teams' measurements of 14 kilometers measured by poles differed by 10 centimeters. So that was the only variation, which I think you have to say is a pretty good standard of accuracy, even now, let alone with the gear that they had. So we did unwisely briefly venture onto the ice, but Mark and I, once again, were sort of playing around with something. So there we are. There's more up in the mountains actually, but you can see just how rough the terrain is around this part of the world. That sort of arduousness of that work, absolutely, though he probably wasn't aware of it at the time, once again, he would have been in his early 30s then, left an absolutely indelible mark on Celsius's health, certainly contributed to his early death. But it was because he'd been out on the ice in that permanent cold that I think he died as early as he did. And from all of that effort came the answer. So what do we think then? Satsuma or lemon? Any guesses? Satsuma, yeah, I'll go with that. So the answer is, no spoilers here, the Earth is not a perfect sphere. It is, as Newton predicted or theorized, a slightly flattened sphere, not by much, 50 kilometers or thereabouts, about a 1 in 300 difference, and not an elongated thing as Cassini had suggested. And so grateful was Louis XV for Celsius and his friends helping to unravel this mystery that he awarded Celsius a lifetime pension of 1,000 livres, it's called 1,000, and a pound of silver. So in modern equivalent, that's probably around £250,000 a year. So he went from being virtually penniless to not badly off, and he thought, gosh, I've got some money here to do something with. At which point he returned to his grand vision of creating an observatory, and where else better to do it than in Uppsala, his hometown. So here he is. This is the other sort of probably reliable likeness of Celsius. He's in his late 30s by now. Let's do the same thing again. What changes do you notice compared to that very youthful late 20s? What does he look like now? Do you think he's come back from the Arctic? He's got a bit of money. What do you think? How does he look now? I've done it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you can actually see some weariness there. He looks a bit weather beaten, doesn't he? I mean, once again, just imagine that what he'd been experiencing. Yeah. Clearly older, a little bit fuller of figure. I think he looks assured there. I mean, you said confident straight away, but there's something about his poise that says, I have absolutely come of age as a scientist now. Within less than 5 years of that painting, he was dead. So once again, only a short period in which to do that. And yeah, that's what he did. He managed through some pretty interesting tactics to persuade the Senate of the University of Uppsala to put up some money to buy a property in the centre of Uppsala and build what was Scandinavia's first astronomical observatory. It's still there. And this is once again actually how I stumbled across this story in the first place, because my friend Rafe Edwards, who I think might be watching online, Englishman who works in Sweden, when I was with him in Uppsala working on another book, we walked down the street and he said, that's where Celsius used to work. And I literally stopped in the street. I said, oh, what? As in centigrade temperature? And he said, yeah. And it just sent this jolt through me that made me think, gosh, so this is where this person, I mean, I didn't know there was a Celsius, in whose name not only do we run our everyday lives, but actually through the UN climate change targets, we actually measure the entire prospects of humanity now in his name. The whole idea is that we try and limit temperatures to more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And it just sent this shock through me, and that was what set me off on this path. And as you can probably see, there's a right opposite the observatory is this rather nice statue of him. And I think once again, even though that's a very heavily stylized version, very modern version, there's still something characterful about this depiction of him, a certain nobility and all of the other qualities that you said earlier on. So let's talk a little bit about our changing climate and what Celsius's discoveries, his mind, his methods, his manners can teach us and how they might guide us from where we are today. So as many of you will know, next month, 11th to the 22nd of November, the latest in the annual UN climate change conferences will be happening in the capital of Azerbaijan, in Baku. And the targets that were set by the Paris Accords to, as it says there, limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, that's what they'll be looking at, is progress. I don't know whether it will actually be officially announced then, but we can take it pretty much as read that that target has already been failed. The likelihood of us as a species being able to keep global temperatures within that range is probably already passed some time ago. So we're looking at somewhat beyond that. A lot of that global warming, which just think about the last few weeks, the stuff we've been watching, the hurricanes, record-breaking temperatures, that sort of stuff is pretty much already baked in for the next half a century or so. So it's what we start doing now that might affect things beyond. And as I said, if you want evidence of that, I mean, apart from the climate stripes on the book and my shirt, which I'll come back to in a minute, in the last year actually, across just the sort of southern part of the northern hemisphere, for the first time in recorded history, we've got temperatures of more than 50 degrees centigrade being recorded quite frequently. So there's actually 10 countries listed there which should have been experiencing 50-degree heat. Anyone ever experienced anything like that? No? Charlie, my cousin Charlie, who brought up in Australia, what was the hottest you ever
Low 40s.
Low 40s.
Yeah.
So add another 10 on that then.
Sure, I think.
Yeah, doesn't bear thinking about it, does it? So, and that the numbers of countries and their location that belong to that rather ignoble, you might call it sort of 50-degree club, death zone, is increasing year on year. Some of them you probably expect, Saudi Arabia, Libya, you think, well, yeah, fair enough, given where they are. And so this chart plots what might happen to that, how often you get those 50-degree temperatures without climate change. Second column is where we are today, and then some projections into the mid-century and late century. You can see basically both the frequency and the distribution of where in the world we're going to start experiencing those temperatures comes up. And I think the thing that strikes me about that list is, you may say, well, what does it matter to me what's going on in Qatar? But even if it doesn't, probably a lot of us go on holiday to Spain or Morocco or Tunisia. Think what happened to Michael Mosley last year on holiday in Greece. This is going to become a regular occurrence, absolutely life-threatening occurrence as the 21st century develops. Which brings me to, I probably think, for me anyway, one of the most important lessons from Celsius, because if you go back to those other things he studied, so the Northern Lights, sea levels, air pressure, the shape of the Earth, those enormous phenomena, if you think about them, are actually just the cumulative effect of countless tiny little actions. So air pressure is all to do with the weight of air molecules. The Northern Lights, billions of particles dancing around in our atmosphere, which creates the Northern Lights. Sea levels is to do with, as I said, the effect of glaciers. It's these tiny thousands of effects, cumulative, that he studied. And I think if we're looking for where we might go in terms of responding to this, then the same applies to the solutions and paths that we might follow. So I think it is these tiny little actions that all of us take in our everyday lives that, when added up, give us, if there is any chance of mitigating the effects of this, our best hope. So yes, governments, scientists, policymakers can lead, but actually it's up to all of us. It's the decisions we make in our everyday lives that, when put together, will add up to something. And I think the reason we can have hope about that is simply because how many of us are there. So the big human elephant in the room, if you like, is human population. So this graph charts human population growth from beginning of the 16th century, projects it up to the end of this century, and you can see over the last 150 years or so how industrialization has driven growth, and how unequally distributed that is. So most of the population growth that's going on now is happening in Africa and Asia, no surprise. But the big question is how will our planet, effectively a sealed system, cope with 10 billion people by about the middle of this century? Pause for thought, isn't it? And I think that brings me to one of my other favourite reflections on Celsius, was that he had this almost kind of instinctive understanding of time. So as I said, he only worked for 20 years, and yet somehow or other, he was kind of able to peer through that tiny little aperture of his present to see not only vast amounts of time that had happened in the past, but also what would happen at vast amounts of time in the future. He had this incredible ability to put time into context. And I was with some friends at the weekend, and we were playing around with this demonstration of it. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. So if you imagine your outstretched arm is the history of this planet. So when the Earth was formed, roughly at your shoulder. So this was a lifeless planet up until sort of midway down your arm. So the first single-celled organisms probably appeared back here. Dinosaurs, if you want to plot someone familiar, is about that last joint on your finger. And the last couple of million years, when humans, or certainly Homo sapiens, have been around, is on your fingernails. So every time we cut our fingernails, we are erasing the entire human history. I can see my friend Andy looking at me back there, because we said this at the weekend. He said, well, don't cut your fingernails. Might be missing point there. But once again, I think it's important we have pause for thought and think that this place where we live, it can't possibly be all about us. Our sun is roughly halfway through its life. Our planet sun, the sun. So if you imagine another arm looking the other way, that's about where we are. We're roughly in the middle. So the fact that we just happen to exist in the middle, what goes on in the past and before mustn't be about us. However, as far as any of us knows, feel free to contradict me, we are the only species, either now or at any point in the future, that knows that our species will not be around forever. So all other plants, animals, other organisms live entirely in the moment, as far as we know. And yet humans have this incredible knowledge that we're not going to be around forever. Now that strikes a chord with me because, as many of you will know, I spend some of my time being a funeral celebrant. In fact, some of my colleagues here today. So we spend our time, working time, being around people who've either just died or their friends and family, or sometimes we go and see people before they've died as they're preparing for the end of their life. So as individuals, we have some kind of hard-coded understanding, yeah, we're not going to be around forever. What we don't seem to have cracked yet is the ability to think about that at the species level. We know humans will not be around. And even if we lasted very long, I mean, you know, you'd have to go some to get beyond the fingernails, wouldn't you? So I think that's the challenge really, is how can we use that knowledge and our incredible capabilities to think longer term, just as Celsius did, about what we're doing and what our responsibilities are, our accountabilities are, if any, to what follows us. Finally, I just wanted to reflect, as I said, since we're here at Wolfson College, on the writing experience, and in particular the 2 years that I spent here as a visiting scholar and what I learned. So some of you were at what is becoming inscribed on my brain as the events of the 30th of November 2021, which was the first time I shared some early drafts of my work with other visiting scholars here. Rebecca, I'm looking at you. I think it would be fair to say it wasn't met with universal acclaim and approval, my first draft. Fair? And I hope when you come to read it, you'll always think it's improved. I'm indebted to Dame Hermione Lee, who established the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, who's become a friend from this. That one of the sort of key texts, if you're a biographer, is this book. Some of you may have read it, Footsteps, Adventure of a Romantic Biographer by Richard Holmes. And Hermione showed me this quote, which I'll read out. So this is Richard Holmes speaking. He says, "For me, biography was to become a kind of pursuit, a tracking of the physical trail of someone's path through the path, do well here, past a following of footsteps. You would never catch them. No, you'd never quite catch them. But maybe, if you're lucky, you might write about the pursuit of that fleeting figure in such a way as to bring it alive in the present." So if I've achieved anything by writing this book about someone, and when I set out on this, I was amazed to find there was no English language biography really of Celsius. So if I've achieved anything by capturing his story and writing it down, I hope it's that I've managed to bring him alive in the present. So in my work to research and write this book, obviously I spent thousands of hours looking at hundreds of documents and many weeks planning through stuff. The absolute standout, most moving thing for me, memorable, was this document, which is held in the University Library in Uppsala, and it is the geometry exercise book, now bound, of Anders Celsius when he was about 16. So he was studying geometry at the time. And you open up this book and it's rammed with these incredibly complicated diagrams, all done with a quill pen and iron goulding, and his beautiful writing, page after page after page of these theorems and exercises that he did. And as I was leafing them around, and I just happened to catch one of the pages in the light, I noticed that I could see where he put his compass through you see the little hole there, that's Celsius's compass point. And I think for me, this is another Hermione phrase, it's where you feel a kind of squeeze of the hand from your subject. So even though this guy died 280 years before, there's a moment where you said, gosh, I'm right, he's right beside me. And it's a lovely thing. And even further evidence later on in the book, I mean, even the greatest of geniuses have mishaps and mistakes. So imagine, you've written all that lovely stuff out and then you're not hearing. So it's very moving. On a slightly different note, I mean, as many of you will know, and once again, some of you are involved in it, I spend a lot of my working life, how should we put it, encouraging or helping other people to write more effectively, particularly in their business or in their work. And I often say to people that they wouldn't be in their jobs if they couldn't write. Most people can write to some extent. Where a lot of people, I think, don't pay enough attention to is the thinking and the planning and the structuring that goes into deciding what words they then choose to express themselves. So practicing what I preach for this book, I locked myself up in the Levitt room upstairs and got a big pile of Post-its out. And this is the first cut, if you like, of the structure of the book you have before me, where my excellent mentor, Rebecca, encouraged me just to write down what I wanted to include and then work on the structure of it, split it into groups, you start to see how some chapters are emerging there, probably different themes, and work out the sort of flow of it, how it might be structured. But not just the physical flow, and this is perhaps a really important thing for me, which I've not come across, is Rebecca here, by the way? Don't think so, she may be online. Rebecca also said, you've got to think about the emotional beats, she said, the emotional beats. So she encouraged me to do this kind of heat map, if you like, no pun intended, of what the kind of mood of the book was. So on the left, this is the beginning, prologue, forward, and it goes through there. So you can see you've got this sort of up and down line of what the mood is, moments of great achievement and great enjoyment, moments of tragedy, like dying at 42, for example. So thinking about how you'll work, the rhythm of it as well is very, very important. Great advice. And if I can add, maybe it's a little tip of my own actually from writing, I found it enormously helpful, but particularly if you're a spectacles wearer like myself, so we've got quite a few of us in the room, it really helps enormously to develop a particular pair of spectacles with particular projects. So these are my Celsius glasses. This is a self-portrait taken in the Bodleian Library in January 2020, so just before the pandemic came along and sort of delayed things a little bit. But I tell you, there's something about having a special pair of glasses. You put them on and you think, right, I'm in the zone. Right, a few final points. I think I've probably gone on longer than I predicted. If you've already had a look at the book or when you come to it, you'll notice that the acknowledgement section is extensive and generous. I have to say, you probably count yourself unlucky if you're not mentioned in it anyway. So if you're not, I apologise. And I've already mentioned a few people there. My friend Rafe, who is purely down to him pointing out Celsius's observatory that I came to write this book. My mentor Rebecca, I've mentioned, but I would just like to say a particular thank you to a few other people. Martin Ekman, who's a Swedish scientist to whom I've actually dedicated the book. I think he's watching online. And who'd written the only other English language book about Celsius, and has probably done more to keep just the fact that there was a Celsius alive now than anyone, was enormously helpful. So he didn't see my venture as in any way a competition. He was hugely helpful. He took Pippa and I out and showed us things we would never have seen otherwise. So Martin, a huge thank you to you. And then Alice, who introduced, I mean, it was very much Alice, meeting Alice at the Didcot Writers Group, where she immediately latched onto, I think, what I had in mind. She said, encouraged me to become involved in the Oxford Centre for Life Writing. And then Hannah, where's Hannah? There we go. It was Hannah, who was already an existing visiting scholar, who said to me, went for a coffee one day, she said, Ian, you should think about applying for one of the scholarships. So I said, all right, and we did. So many other people for whom thank you are due. And as I said, everyone, particularly in this community at Wolfson College. But like so much of Celsius's work, my job was very much an act of collaboration and indeed across international boundaries as well. To finish then, just by reflecting on this big issue, which is the sort of thing that runs through the whole book really about our warming planet and what's happening. I think Ed Hawkins, Professor Ed Hawkins from the University of Reading is watching online, unless he's in the room. I've never met you, Ed. No, so Ed was the person who invented this climate strike graphic. And if we needed any evidence of what's going on, so each line either on my shirt or on the book represents a single year's average global temperature compared to the average over the last 250 years or so. So you can see you get this incredible crowding in recent years to becoming hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. So much so, and Ed would correct me, I believe the team have actually had to recalibrate the whole thing. They've run out of red. They can't make it any redder. That's how quickly the temperatures are going up. So plenty of scientific evidence, but if you happen to be around at Wolfson College a couple of years ago, down at the punting dock, it looked like desert. Such was the heat. I don't think, Tim, that had ever happened before. No. So completely unprecedented, just drying up basically. So climate change is not happening somewhere else, or might be happening. It's happening absolutely here and now on our doorstep, and it's a nice. Well, it's not coincidence, but it's been particularly nice for me as I've been exploring these things to be doing so in this environment because thanks to the significant investment made over the last couple of years, Wolfson College is actually certainly Britain's first net zero educational establishment, possibly the world's. We're not sure about that, but that's a possible claim. So what a nice coincidence. At the same time, I've been thinking and writing about this. It's been doing it in a place which is actually doing something about this. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from Celsius, which was he wrote down in a letter to one of his friends around the time of in the middle of his grand tour, and he wrote, "It will bestow on our century a greater honour to have left true observations to later generations, rather than false hypotheses which can easily be refuted." So if you think about the times that we live in now, we're surrounded by misinformation, disinformation, almost anti-enlightenment. I think we can only hope that we can be able to look back and say the same about our generation. So as you have a chance to read the book and as you go from here, and as you think about, as I said, the own decisions and choices that you make in your life and the way in which you interpret the world around you, all of those things I've said about Celsius, an internationalist, a collaborator, somebody who thought long term, somebody who was conscious of the cumulative effect of tiny actions, a brave person of enormous fortitude, determination. Try and harness that, and if you can, please think Celsius. Thank you.
Well done, well done.
You're very kind. Now, how long did I bang on there for? I haven't got to watch it. A little longer than 25 minutes. So there is going to be some refreshments at the back, but I should say polite for me to pause and see if anybody had any questions or reactions or comments from any of that we've just talked about. I hope it hasn't left you too despondent about things. As I said, there is hope if we look hard for it, I think.
Ian,
Can you tell us a little bit about your source material, the archives you use, and whether it's Swedish?
Okay, so the question is, I'll just repeat it in case people online can hear it. What was the source material for this? How I went about accessing it, and did I have to look Swedish in order to access it? I think I probably failed on the last one straight away. I don't think I blend in too well in the Swedish. It's a country I've come to love from doing this, and a part of the world I've come to love. I think the rest of the world could learn an awful lot from looking at the way Scandinavian countries and Sweden in particular go about their business. So luckily, even though he was only around for a relatively short time, Celsius, as you've probably seen from some of the documents, was an incredible documenter of his work. He wrote stuff down, so there are a lot of his writing around. The challenge for me is that the vast bulk of that was either in Swedish or more especially in Latin. So I was, once again, in the acknowledgement, so I thank people there who helped me decode some of it. He could speak and write English, so when certainly some of the accounts of his time in England are written in English, which is a great help. The Royal Society, of which he was a member, were incredibly helpful, and once again, a real thrill to go to the Royal Society Library and get hands on the original stuff. You open up their members book, and it's still the same. They've only got one members book; it's not been filled up yet. Member number 1, Charles II. So it's a real thrill to go and have that kind of stuff. And enormously helpful access, particularly in Sweden, through the university libraries, and obviously as I extended beyond just thinking about Celsius itself, it took me into all kinds of different meteorological, earth science kind of sources, and for obvious reasons, it is very much a live area of study and research and academic endeavour right now for the reasons we've just talked about. So plenty of material out there. Going back to the events of the 30th of November 2021 of my first sharing group, there were some issues about speculation of how I knew some of these details, and there is a degree of imagination in the book, but the vast majority of it is based on, I hope, solid research and facts. These are real people, real events, as I said, both in the past, now, and in the future that we're looking about. Good question, Rennie, thank you. Any other? Bruce?
You've spoken a lot about his relevance to us and our thoughts about climate change. Did he have any particular perceptions of change in the climate? You've talked about sea levels and so on, but did he actually project his thinking very far forward at all?
Good question. So the question is, given that Celsius, as I said, in 1722 started to keep climate records, did he have much sense of where they were going and how much did he project? Yes, in fact, very specifically, yes, he at one point did a 10,000 year progression of what temperatures might be, and which also then took in sea levels.
Don't
So
need
he-
to type fast. You can type any message that she will then relay. Would you like
Welcome.
to-
So he invested, and once again, at the time he was doing this, he was still pretty penniless, so he invested in a great big long roll of the finest paper he could afford. A bit like Jack Kerouac must have done with On the Road or something, and he did this 10,000 year projection of temperatures. So absolutely, it was something that he was thinking about, and I think that's a great, was kind of physical manifestation of that this was somebody who thought incredibly long term about things.
What conclusions did he come to?
I would have to go and check that. I don't know actually exactly whether or how close he would have been. But I suspect even he would not have forecast the level of climate change. And certainly, I don't know if there's any climate scientists among us, but most of what we're experiencing now has been predicted. What hasn't been predicted is how quickly it's happening and the extent to which it's happening. So it's the speed and the intensity of it that is kind of catching us out a bit at the moment. But as I said, most of the things we're experiencing by the day now are as expected. Fran first, and then we'll come to Ruth, sorry.
Did you find out anything about his personal life? Did he have any significant others? What did he do
Mine
for
was the
fun
same.
when he wasn't doing all his, research?
Yeah, so the
Did he have
question
a
is,
family?
how much did I find out about Celsius's personal life? Did he have any significant others, and what did he do? Was it when he wasn't busy being a scientist? Excellent question. And actually, going right back to that first image of him, I think you can kind of detect a slight loneliness in that first picture. So there is absolutely no record of him ever having he certainly didn't marry, he certainly didn't have any children. He didn't record, and no one else around him recorded him ever having any kind of particular romantic relationships. He was a person who was absolutely devoted to his science, and maybe he knew he wouldn't be around for very long. So he, for the bulk of his adult life, in which you may be doing those things, starting families, having relationships, he worked and worked and worked himself to death eventually. Is there another part to your question I've forgotten, Fran?
Oh, what did he do for fun?
Oh yeah, so not much is the short answer. I mean, he was by all accounts an absolutely charming company. He could sing, he could tell stories, he could play the guitar. Can't think anybody that reminds me of. I say play.
And sing.
I've got my band in the house. No, he was a charming, effervescent person, but as I said, entirely driven by his science and his work. And clearly, if he hadn't put as much work in there, there wouldn't be so much to tell about him, would there? So I guess that's the deal. And Ruth.
Well, mine was pretty much the same question, so I've now trying to think of something else. But because you've spent so much time with him, in your head, do you see, I mean, we've seen the two pictures, but do you actually see him sort of move? I mean, do you see him as a kind of filmatic type of thing in your head now? You've spent so much time thinking about him. And when you think of him, do you see him moving and talking and
Yeah, so I know I was a bit flippant about, so sorry, the question was, having spent time in virtually anyway in Celsius's company over a number of years, do I feel him and do I see him and do I imagine him? Yes, is the short answer, and I'm even slightly flippant about the experience on the top of the hill there, where I imagined him whispering in the trees to me. But the more time I spent with him, not only was the more awestruck was I by his intellectual capabilities and his achievements, but just what an incredibly nice person and wise person this was. So I have rather candidly, I think, reserved the rights for creative interpretations of the book. So if anybody wants to make Celsius the opera, ballet, film, come talk to me. In fact, the weekend we were speculating which actor or which might project, who did we get to in the end?
Tom Cruise.
It wasn't Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise is already about half as old again as he was when he died. We did come up with somebody. I can't remember who it was. Tom Hiddleston was mentioned, but I think somebody else was mentioned as well.
Eddie Redmayne.
Eddie Redmayne. Yeah, Eddie Redmayne. I thought was making not bad. Celsius. Any other questions before we dive into the Yes, Alice.
I've got one from Shirley online, who is
Shirley Tung.
Yeah.
Ah, Shirley, so glad you could make it.
She says, I remember while reading an early draft in November 2022, Ian found it challenging to balance quoting from primary material extemporizing upon it to create a fluid narrative. What strategies worked best for you to find the balance?
Yeah. So how did I balance this working from source material and then trying to make it into an entertaining, readable story with a degree of extemporizing, or dare I say, imagination going on? I think that's an absolute universal challenge, really. I mean, I'm thinking about when looking at my funeral colleagues here, we have to some extent do the same thing. The person we're writing about has died, so we haven't met them. We're reliant on other people's accounts of them, and sometimes, certainly when I come away from meeting a family for someone to do a funeral, you know, I have to try and imagine them. So obviously you don't make stuff up, but you know, you interpret it and you weave things together and you join dots to try and come up with the most compelling illustration of them. I would say it's the single greatest thing that I owe a great debt to you, Alice, and everyone at the Centre for Life Writings. I know I slightly once again flippantly talked about the events of 30th of November 2021, but it was, you know, I've had tougher experiences in life, but it really taught me something that you can't just write a serious scientific biography and make stuff up. You have to think really carefully about where that line sits. There's very little actual spoken dialogue in the books, which some people thought was a weakness of it. But once again, for me, that rolls crossing a line. I don't know who said what to what. Very little of Celsius's writing record actual conversations. There's a few bits, like for example, some of the conversations he had with Edmund Halley, who was the astronomer royal at the time he was in London, so as in Halley's Comet. So there's a few bits of actual spoken dialogue that were recorded, but very little. But as I said, I would probably pick that out, and I'm pleased Shirley's mentioned it as, yeah, being something I had to learn as I went, really. I probably haven't got it right. There is no right, but I hope it works, is what I would say. Right, you look like a group of people who need some teas and coffee, so thank you for sitting through that. So the Elspeth for most of the books in Abingdon is selling some books here. If any of you are desperate to have my signature in it, I'm very happy to oblige. Selling some books. Tea, coffee, cold drinks, and so on at the back, including some vegan and gluten-free. If you've never been to Wolfson College before, I would really encourage you to spend a bit of time walking around here. I mean, this is a special place in a different way, not just for its net zero credentials, but the architecture, which is something I've been spending a bit of time on recently. It's a very special place. So go and have a look at the way this building connects to the river and just have a wander around. Or so Tim Nixon's here as the president. I don't know if you've got a moment, Tim, to tell people about Wolfson or not, but yeah, just have a look around while you're here, if you're not with it. And once again, thank you all so much for being part of today. Let's chat more. Thank you all.